The wind swept across the rolling plains of the Montana Territory, not with the biting edge of winter, but with the heavy, humid promise of a spring storm. It carried the scent of wet sage, turning earth, and the ozone tang of lightning that danced silently over the distant peaks. Thorne stood at the edge of his porch, a rough-hewn structure that had settled into the landscape much like the man himself. He wiped his hands on a rag, grease staining the fabric, and looked out toward the horizon. The sky was a bruised tapestry of charcoal and violent violet, threatening a deluge that would turn the hard-packed trails into impassable rivers of gumbo mud. Thorne was a man carved from the geography he inhabited, silent, enduring, and weathered. He had spent the last 12 years alone, a self-imposed exile that had calcified into a comfortable, if lonely, existence. The ranch was his kingdom, and silence was his court. He turned to head inside, intending to secure the shutters before the heavens opened, when a sound disrupted the rhythm of the approaching storm. It was the groan of wood under stress and the jingle of harness-traced chains. He squinted against the flat, gray light. A wagon was emerging from the stand of cottonwoods near the creek bed. It was a haggard vehicle, listing dangerously to the starboard side, pulled by a mule that looked as though it had walked across the continent twice. Thorne did not reach for the rifle leaning by the door. He had an instinct for danger, and this pathetic conveyance radiated nothing but desperation. He walked down the steps, his boots sinking slightly into the softening earth, and waited by the gate. The driver was a small figure wrapped in layers of damp wool and silks that had once been vibrant but were now faded by dust and sun. As the wagon creaked to a halt, the figure climbed down. It was an old woman, her movements stiff with the damp ache of the coming rain. Her face was a landscape of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and dark, holding a glint of iron will that belied her frail body. Beside her, emerging from the canvas cover of the wagon, was a younger woman. She stepped down into the mud with a grace that seemed out of place in the frontier, keeping her gaze lowered but her shoulders square. The old woman walked up to the fence, ignoring the thunder that rumbled low in the west. She studied Thorne, her eyes dissecting him, cataloging the calluses on his hands and the weary set of his jaw. She nodded once, a sharp, bird-like movement. "I heard you want a wife," the old woman said. Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering over stone, but it carried clearly over the rising wind. She gestured to the younger woman, who stood motionless by the mule's flank, rain beginning to spot her dark hair. "My daughter is perfect for you." Thorne blinked, the absurdity of the statement momentarily stunning him. He looked from the old woman to the daughter, then back to the matriarch. "I didn't ask for a wife," Thorne said, his voice gravelly from days of disuse, "and I don't look for company." The old woman stepped closer, gripping the wet rail of the fence. "Want and need are different things, rancher. The rains are here. The creek will rise by midnight, and the road back is already gone. You have a dry roof. I have a daughter who needs one, and I am out of time." Thorne looked at the sky. She was right about the weather. The bottom was about to drop out, and anyone caught on the trail would be bogged down or washed away. He looked at the daughter again. She raised her eyes, meeting his. There was no pleading there, only a quiet fortitude. She looked like someone who had walked a long, hard road and was ready to stop walking. "Get the mule in the barn," Thorne said, the decision made more by the sky than the offer. "You can wait out the storm." The interior of the cabin was defined by utility. The main room was dominated by a large stone hearth where a fire already snapped, chasing away the damp chill of the spring air. Thorne poured water from a kettle, the steam rising in the dim light. The old woman, who introduced herself as Madame Liang, sat in the armchair nearest the warmth. Her breathing was wet and labored, a rattling sound that spoke of fluid in the lungs and a heart that was tired of beating. The daughter, May, stood near the window, watching the rain begin to sheet down, turning the world outside into a blurred watercolor. Thorne leaned against the heavy oak table, his arms crossed. "This is temporary," Thorne said, his voice low. "Once the road's dry, you move on." Madame Liang did not waste energy on pleasantries. She spoke of the railroad camps further west, of the sickness that thrived in the wet season, and the impossible journey to the coast she knew she would never complete. She was dying. The rattle in her chest was a countdown. She needed to place May where the girl would not be consumed by the harshness of the territory. "She cooks," Madame Liang said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "She plants. She is strong like bamboo. She bends in the wind, but she does not break. She will not ask for your heart, rancher, only your protection." Thorne looked at May. "This is a working ranch," he said. "It's mud, blood, and long days. It's no place for a woman." May turned from the window. "I am not afraid of work," she said softly. Her voice was melodious, accented with a cadence that sounded like music compared to the flat drawl of the frontier. "And I am not afraid of mud. Loneliness is the harder thing," Madame Liang wheezed, a coughing fit doubling her over. When she straightened, she wiped a speck of blood from her lip. "She can stay until the flood waters recede," Thorne said, feeling the weight of the moral trap springing shut around him. "In the dry season, she decides where she goes." "Good," Madame Liang whispered, closing her eyes. "That is good." That night, the storm broke with a violence that shook the cabin on its foundation. Thunder cracked like a whip directly overhead, and the rain hammered the roof in a deafening torrent. Amidst the fury of the spring tempest, Madame Liang died in her sleep, sitting in the chair by the fire, her duty finally discharged. The next morning, the world was a sodden, dripping mess. The rain had paused, leaving behind a heavy gray sky and ground that was slick and treacherous. Digging the grave was not the battle against ice that winter would have brought, but a struggle against the mud. The earth was heavy, clinging to the shovel with a suction that required immense effort to break. Thorne worked through the morning, sweat mixing with the misty rain on his brow. May stood by the wrapped body of her mother beneath a dripping cottonwood tree. She did not weep. Her grief was a private, contained thing, held tight within her posture. When the earth was filled in and heavy river stones placed to deter the wolves, they stood for a moment in the humid silence. "I'm sorry," Thorne said. May nodded, touching the rough bark of the tree. "She waited," May said. "She waited until we were safe. That was her way." They walked back to the cabin, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. The dynamic had shifted. The buffer of the elder was gone. It was just the two of them, strangers bound by a promise made to the dead and trapped by the swollen creek that had turned the ranch into an island. Thorne pointed to the small bedroom in the back. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep in the loft." "I do not wish to displace you," May said. "The loft stays warmer," Thorne lied. "Heat rises." Weeks bled into a month as the spring rains continued, relentless and transformative. The ranch became a world of green and brown, vibrant, exploding grass and deep, churning mud. A routine formed, fragile and tentative. Thorne rose before dawn to tend the stock, checking the herd for new calves born in the night. When he returned, the cabin was orderly, the floor swept of dried mud, and a meal prepared. May moved through his space with a quiet efficiency that unnerved him. She did not try to rearrange his life, but she optimized it. The chaotic pile of mending he had ignored for years was suddenly repaired. She found the sack of dried beans and turned them into savory stews seasoned with wild onions she found near the creek. They spoke rarely. The conversations were utilitarian. "The creek is still high," he would report. "The roof is leaking in the corner," she would note. "I'll patch it," he would reply. Yet there was a growing reliance. Thorne found himself watching her when she didn't know he was looking. He watched her hands, strong and capable, kneading dough. He watched the way she stood on the porch in the evenings, breathing in the scent of wet earth and sage, her face peaceful. He wondered about her life before the wagon, but he did not ask. He respected her silence because he demanded respect for his own. Spring in the territory was the busiest season. The cattle were calving, and the new grass meant constant movement. The mud made everything harder. Horses slipped, wagon wheels sank, and boots became leaden weights. Thorne tried to keep May inside, adhering to an antiquated code of protection, but she ignored him with a stubbornness that mirrored her mother's. One afternoon, he found her in the vegetable patch, a plot of land he had neglected for years. She was knee-deep in mud, wrestling with a hoe, turning the heavy, wet soil. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her cheeks, but she was working with a rhythmic intensity. "You don't have to do this," Thorne said, leaning on the fence. "The ground is too wet. It'll clump." May didn't stop. "The sun is coming," she said, breath pluming in the cool air. "When it dries it will be too hard. We must turn it now." "We?" Thorne asked. May stopped and looked at him. She wiped her forehead with a muddy glove. "I eat your food. I sleep under your roof. I will work your land." Thorne watched her, seeing the tremble in her arm she tried to hide. He opened the gate and stepped into the garden. He took the hoe from her hands. For a second, their fingers brushed, warmth against warmth in the cool damp. He didn't send her away. Instead, he walked to the shed, grabbed a spade, and returned. "If we're going to plant," he said, digging the spade into the heavy soil, "we need to trench it for drainage first. Otherwise, the seeds will rot." They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon, turning the dark, rich earth. The physical exertion created a camaraderie that words could not. When they finished, they sat on the porch steps, scraping mud from their boots. Thorne looked at her, seeing not a refugee, but a partner. "You possess a strong back," he said. May smiled, a faint expression that touched her eyes. "My mother said I was bamboo, hard to break." "Bamboo," Thorne mused. "Don't see much of that around here. Mostly sage and pine. They snap if you push 'em too hard. Maybe we need more bamboo." The true test came 2 weeks later. The rains had stopped, but the runoff from the mountains had turned the creek into a raging torrent that threatened to breach the banks near the lower pasture. Thorne was out moving the herd to higher ground, fighting the panicked cattle in the sucking mud. He was riding his roan gelding, pushing a stubborn heifer up the ridge, when the bank beneath the cow gave way. The animal slid into the churning brown water, bellowing in terror. Thorne didn't think. He spurred the horse into the water, swinging his rope. He managed to loop the heifer's neck, but the current was ferocious. It caught the cow, dragging her downstream, and the weight pulled Thorne's horse off balance. The gelding panicked, twisting in the water. Thorne was thrown from the saddle. The cold water hit him like a hammer, stealing his breath. He tumbled in the dark, gritty current, striking his shoulder hard against a submerged log. Pain exploded in his arm, white-hot and blinding. He gasped, swallowing water, fighting to find the surface. He managed to grab a willow branch hanging low over the water, hauling himself half onto the muddy bank, gasping for air. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder dislocated. He lay there in the mud, the rain starting to fall again, staring up at the gray sky, wondering if he could make it back to the house. Then he felt hands on him. May was there. She had seen the accident from the garden and had actually run, through the muck to reach him. She was drenched, her face pale with fear, but her hands were steady. "Thorne," she said, gripping his good arm. "Can you stand?" "Shoulders out," he gritted through his teeth. "Can't get leverage." May didn't hesitate. She wedged her small shoulder under his good arm, wrapping her arm around his waist. "Lean on me," she commanded. "I have you." It was a slow, agonizing mile back to the cabin. May, much smaller than him, bore his weight without complaint, her boots finding traction where his failed. She didn't offer empty comforts. She just kept moving, forcing him to match her pace. Inside the cabin, she helped him to the chair by the fire. The pain was a dull, throbbing roar. She cut his wet shirt away, revealing the angry swelling of the joint. "I need to set it," she said, looking at him. "It will hurt." "Do it," Thorne said, bracing himself. She placed her foot against the chair leg and took his arm. She was surprisingly strong, her movements precise. With a sharp tug and a twist, the bone popped back into the socket. Thorne cried out, a raw sound, before slumping back, sweat pouring down his face. May immediately began applying a poultice of arnica and hot towels. Her hands were gentle now, washing the mud from his skin, her touch cool and medicinal. Thorne watched her through half-closed eyes. The barrier of distance he had maintained was gone, washed away in the river. "You shouldn't have come into the water," he rasped. "Dangerous." "You were drowning," she said simply, wringing out a cloth. "I could not let the water take you." "Why?" She paused, looking at him. The firelight cast shadows across her face, highlighting the curve of her cheekbone. "Because you're the only thing in this world that is solid," she said, "and because I'm tired of saying goodbye to people." The admission hung in the room, heavy as the humidity. Thorne reached out with his good hand and took hers. Her skin was rough from the garden work, her nails short. It was the hand of a woman who built things. "I ain't going anywhere," he promised. By late May, the land began to dry. The mud hardened into solid earth, the grass turned a vibrant emerald green, and wildflowers exploded across the valley floor in riots of yellow and purple. The creek receded to a gentle, babbling ribbon of clear water. The road to town was open. Thorne spent his mornings repairing the wagon. He replaced the cracked spokes on the starboard wheel, greased the axles, and mended the torn canvas cover. Every repair felt like a betrayal, a physical manifestation of the promise he had made to a dead woman. In the dry season, she decides. He wanted the wagon to rot. He wanted the wheels to crumble, but he was a man of his word. May came out to the barn around midday, carrying a basket of lunch. She wore a dress she had sewn from fabric he had bought from a peddler weeks ago, a soft blue that matched the spring sky. She watched him tighten the final bolt on the wheel. "It looks strong," she said, setting the basket on a hay bale. Thorne didn't look up. "It'll hold. Get you to the railhead, or the city, wherever you're aiming for." He wiped his hands on a rag, finally meeting her gaze. She wasn't looking at the wagon. She was looking at the hills, where the cattle were grazing peacefully. "The road is clear?" she asked. "Likely," Thorne said. "Another week of sun, and it'll be hard as iron." They ate in silence, sitting on the workbench. The air smelled of drying hay and horses. Thorne wanted to ask her where she would go. He wanted to tell her that the city was a cesspool, that the world out there didn't know how to value a woman who could set a bone and trench a garden. But he felt he had no right. "You'll need money," he said abruptly. "I have the cattle money in the tin box for your ticket." May stopped eating. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I do not need your money, Thorne. I have my hands." She stood up, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "The wagon looks ready. You're a good mechanic." She turned and walked back to the house, leaving him alone with the smell of grease and the sickening realization that he had just treated the most important person in his life like a business transaction. The week passed in a blur of agonizing normalcy. On the final evening, the cabin was scoured clean. May had packed her small bundle of belongings. She sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. Thorne paced the length of the room, the floorboards groaning under his boots. "You should take the gray mare," Thorne said, breaking the silence. "The mule is old. He won't make the journey." May looked up, her eyes reflecting the dying embers. "The mule is mine. The mare is yours." "Take the damn horse, May," Thorne snapped, the anger rising from his grief. "I don't need another mouth to feed." May stood up, her patience fraying. "Why are you angry? You fulfilled your promise. The floods are gone. The road is open. You are free." "Free?" Thorne laughed, a harsh sound. "Is that what this is?" He stopped pacing and faced her. "I got used to the noise," he said, his voice dropping. The noise?" she asked, confused. "We barely speak." "Not that noise," Thorne said, tapping his chest. "The noise of being alone. It's a loud thing. Silence. You made it stop, and now you're bringing it back." May stared at him, her lips parted. She took a step toward him. "I did not ask to leave," she said softly. "I said the season would decide." Thorne looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the fear and the stubbornness. He saw the hesitation in her stance. She was waiting. She had been waiting for him to wake up. "The wagon is fixed," he said, his voice trembling. "I fixed it because I said I would." May reached out and took his hand, her skin warm against his. "Break it," she whispered. "Break the wheel, Thorne." The invitation was clear. It wasn't about the wagon. It was about permission. It was about choosing a hard life over an empty one. Thorne pulled her to him then, his restraint shattering. He held her, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of her against him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him with a strength that matched his own. "Don't go," he mumbled into her hair. "Don't you dare go." The morning light was gold and soft, filtering through the window with the promise of a warm day. The wagon stood in the yard, the dew heavy on its repaired wheel. It sat empty. The mule was grazing in the paddock, unbothered by the lack of a harness. Inside, the fire was built up high. Thorne sat at the table, watching May pour coffee. She moved with a settled, quiet gravity. She placed the cup in front of him, her hand brushing his shoulder as she passed. He caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "I need to weed the garden," she said, looking out the window at the rows of green shoots pushing through the black earth. "The sun is strong today." Thorne nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. "I'll help you," he said, "after I check the fence line." "No," she said firmly. "You fix the fence. I tend the garden. I know what needs to grow." Thorne chuckled, the sound rich and easy. "Yes, ma'am." He stood up, putting his hat on. He walked to the door, then stopped and turned back. She was watching him, standing in the center of the room that was no longer just a shelter, but a home. Thorne looked at the woman who had come to him in a broken wagon and stayed to save him from himself. "I'm glad you came," he said, the words simple and plain. "I'm glad the rain trapped you." May laughed, a soft sound like water over stones. "There was never a trap, Thorne," she said, picking up her basket. "Just a wagon, and a direction." He opened the door, letting the fresh spring air rush in, smelling of wildflowers and new beginnings. He stepped out onto the porch, looking at the horizon. The mountains were still there, vast and imposing, but they didn't look like a prison anymore. They looked like a fence line, protecting what was his. He walked down the steps, his boots firm on the dry ground, ready to work, no longer just surviving the silence, but living for the harvest.